long shadows across the forward operating base as Dr. Elena Vasquez made her rounds through the makeshift medical tent. Her movements were deliberate and gentle, checking on the wounded soldiers who had arrived during the night. The other personnel barely noticed her presence. She had that kind of quiet demeanor that seemed to blend into the background noise of military operations. At 32, Elena appeared unremarkable to most who encountered her. Average height, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an almost scholarly appearance. She wore the standard-issue medical fatigues with sleeves rolled up to her elbows, revealing lean forearms marked only by a small, faded scar near her left wrist that she never talked about. What the soldiers didn't know, what even Colonel Martinez, who commanded the base, didn't fully comprehend, was that before Dr. Elena Vasquez became a medic, she had been Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The transition hadn't been gradual or planned. It had been born from necessity, trauma, and a desperate need to save lives rather than take them. 5 years ago, during a night raid in Afghanistan that went catastrophically wrong, Elena had watched her entire squad get torn apart by an IED blast. She had been the only survivor left to perform battlefield medicine on her dying brothers-in-arms with nothing but basic combat medic training and sheer determination. That night, covered in blood and dirt, cradling the head of her dying squad leader as he whispered his final words, she made a promise that would reshape the rest of her life. The base where Elena now served was situated in a volatile region where insurgent activity had been steadily increasing. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were becoming more organized, more daring in their attacks. But life on the FOB continued with its routine rhythm: morning briefings, patrol rotations, equipment maintenance, and the constant background hum of generators and radio chatter. Elena had integrated seamlessly into this environment, earning respect through her medical competence and gentle bedside manner. She treated everything from minor cuts and heat exhaustion to more serious combat injuries, always with the same calm professionalism that had become her trademark. Lieutenant Jackson, a fresh-faced officer barely out of West Point, often found excuses to visit the medical tent. He was drawn to Elena's quiet confidence, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what made her different from other medical personnel he'd encountered. During one of their conversations over coffee in the mess hall, he had asked her about her background. Elena had deflected with practiced ease, mentioning medical school and a residency at a civilian hospital, conveniently omitting the years of Ranger training that had forged her into something far more dangerous than anyone suspected. She had learned to hide that part of herself so completely that sometimes even she forgot the weight of the weapons she had once carried, the precision with which she had once moved through hostile territory. The other soldiers respected her medical skills but treated her as they would any non-combatant personnel, someone to be protected rather than someone capable of protection. Sergeant Williams, a gruff veteran with multiple deployments under his belt, often made jokes about keeping Doc safe during their perimeter sweeps. Private Johnson, barely 19 and on his first deployment, would blush and stammer whenever Elena tended to his minor ailments, clearly harboring a crush on the kind doctor who always had a reassuring word and gentle touch for everyone under her care. Even Captain Rodriguez, the base's intelligence officer, viewed Elena as a civilian asset to be safeguarded rather than a potential tactical resource. Elena's daily routine had become almost meditative in its consistency. She would rise before dawn, check on any overnight patients, review medical supplies with Corpsman Peterson, a capable but inexperienced medic who looked up to her with obvious admiration, and then spend her morning treating the inevitable stream of soldiers dealing with everything from digestive issues to minor injuries sustained during training exercises. Her afternoons were often spent in the small office she had claimed as her own, updating medical records, ordering supplies, and occasionally video calling her sister Maria back in San Antonio, carefully editing out any details that might worry her family about the true nature of her deployment. The most remarkable thing about Elena was how completely she had suppressed the warrior that still lived beneath her healer's exterior. Years of therapy and conscious effort had helped her channel her military training into medical precision. The same hands that had once field-stripped weapons in complete darkness now sutured wounds with artistic delicacy. The same mind that had once calculated firing solutions and tactical approaches now diagnosed complex medical conditions and planned treatment protocols. The same body that had once moved through enemy territory like a shadow now navigated the medical tent with fluid efficiency, anticipating needs and responding to crises with an almost supernatural calm. But late at night, when the base settled into its watchful quiet and Elena lay on her narrow cot, listening to the distant sounds of radio checks and guard rotations, sometimes the old instincts would surface. She would catch herself automatically cataloging the sounds around her, identifying potential threats, calculating fields of fire and escape routes. Her body would remember the weight of body armor and the familiar grip of her service weapon. These moments of remembrance were both painful and strangely comforting, reminders of a version of herself that she had deliberately buried but could never completely erase. The other medical personnel viewed her as a mentor and teacher. Corpsman Peterson had learned more about trauma medicine in his 6 months working with Elena than in all his previous training combined. She had a way of explaining complex procedures in simple terms, of demonstrating techniques that seemed to come naturally to her but were clearly the result of extensive experience. When pressed about where she had gained such expertise, Elena would mention volunteer work in emergency rooms, disaster relief efforts, anything that might explain her uncommon skill without revealing the true source of her education in treating catastrophic injuries under extreme pressure. 3 weeks before the ambush that would change everything, Elena had received troubling intelligence reports during the morning briefings she attended as medical officer. Enemy activity in the region was escalating, with several nearby outposts reporting increased hostile contact. The pattern of attacks suggested a level of coordination that made everyone nervous. Colonel Martinez had begun implementing additional security measures, but the base still operated under the assumption that they were dealing with the same disorganized insurgent groups that had been harassing coalition forces for months. Elena, however, recognized something in the tactical descriptions that made her old instincts prickle with unease. The attack patterns bore hallmarks of professional military training, suggesting that their enemies were far more capable than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with Elena conducting her usual pre-dawn rounds through the medical facility. She had just finished checking on Sergeant Morrison, who was recovering from a minor shrapnel wound to his shoulder when the first explosion shattered the relative peace of the base. The blast was close enough to rattle the medical equipment and send dust cascading from the tent ceiling. Elena's body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. Years of suppressed muscle memory kicked in as she instinctively dropped low and moved toward the tent's reinforced corner, her medical training warring with combat instincts that refused to stay buried. "What the hell was that?" Corpsman Peterson shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he struggled to steady a tray of medical instruments that had been knocked to the floor. Elena was already moving, her demeanor shifting almost imperceptibly from gentle healer to something altogether more focused and dangerous. She pressed herself against the tent wall near a gap in the fabric, peering out toward the perimeter where smoke was rising from the direction of the main gate. What she saw made her blood run cold. This wasn't the random harassment they had grown accustomed to. At least 30 armed figures were moving with tactical precision across the open ground between the outer perimeter and the main base structures. They advanced in coordinated fire teams, using suppressing fire and movement techniques that spoke of professional military training. These weren't local insurgents with AK-47s and improvised explosive devices. These were soldiers, possibly foreign special forces or highly trained mercenaries, and they had come prepared for a sustained assault. The base's defensive response was immediate but disorganized. Soldiers stumbled from their quarters, some still pulling on equipment, others shouting confused questions into radio handsets. The guard towers opened fire, but their positioned defenders were clearly outmatched by the coordinated assault. Elena watched through the tent flap as Lieutenant Jackson emerged from the command bunker, pistol in hand, trying to coordinate a defensive response while lacking the experience to deal with an attack of this magnitude and sophistication. "Doc, we need to get out of here." Peterson grabbed Elena's arm, his eyes wide with panic. "They're telling all non-combat personnel to move to the bunkers." But Elena wasn't listening. Her attention was focused on something that made her former ranger training scream warnings. The attackers weren't just assaulting the base. They were moving with specific objectives, flowing around certain defensive positions while concentrating fire on others. This was a precision operation designed to capture or destroy something particular, and Elena's medical intuition told her that something might be intelligence assets, high-value personnel, or worse, the medical facility itself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In recent months, the medical tent had treated several high-ranking officers who had been evacuated from other bases. Information about coalition medical capabilities, casualty rates, and personnel had flowed through her facility. If the attackers were after intelligence, the medical records and possibly the medical staff themselves could be primary targets. Elena's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. They might want to capture medical personnel for propaganda purposes, or eliminate them to deny the coalition forces their medical capabilities. "Peterson, listen to me carefully," Elena said, her voice taking on a tone of authority that the young corpsman had never heard from her before. "I need you to grab the emergency medical kit and the portable surgical supplies. We're not going to the bunkers." Peterson stared at her in confusion, but something in Elena's demeanor, a sudden hardness around her eyes, a way of holding herself that suggested coiled violence, made him nod and move to follow her instructions without question. Elena moved to her personal footlocker, her hands working with practiced efficiency to retrieve items that hadn't seen daylight in years. Beneath her civilian clothes and personal effects lay carefully wrapped and maintained equipment that spoke of a very different kind of service. A tactical vest, slightly worn but meticulously cared for, a combat knife with a blade that gleamed, despite its age, and wrapped in an oiled cloth, a sidearm that Elena had legally retained after her discharge from active combat duty, a Sig Sauer P320 that had saved her life more times than she cared to remember. As Elena strapped on the tactical vest and checked the pistol's action with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed, Peterson's eyes widened with understanding. "Doc, who are you?" His voice was barely audible over the increasing sound of gunfire outside. Elena looked at him for a moment, weighing how much to reveal, then made a decision that would irrevocably change how everyone at the base understood her. 5 years ago, I was Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 75th Ranger Regiment, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. I've been through situations like this before, and right now, that experience might be the only thing that keeps us alive. She moved to the tent's medical supply cabinet, selecting items with the practiced eye of someone who understood battlefield medicine from both sides of the equation. "The wounded in here can't be moved to the bunkers safely. Someone needs to stay and protect them, and someone needs to make sure they get the medical care they'll need when this is over." Peterson stared at her transformation with something approaching awe. The gentle doctor he had worked alongside for months was still there, but now she moved with a predatory grace that suggested violence held in careful check. Elena's entire bearing had changed, her posture more alert, her movements economical and purposeful, her eyes constantly scanning for threats and opportunities. It was as if she had shed a carefully maintained disguise to reveal something far more dangerous underneath. The sound of approaching gunfire grew louder, punctuated by shouts and the distinctive crack of rounds passing close overhead. Elena moved, to the tent's entrance and assessed the tactical situation with the trained eye of someone who had spent years learning to read battlefields. The attackers had breached the perimeter in at least 3 locations and were now moving through the base in coordinated teams. The coalition defenders were falling back toward the central command area, but their retreat was costing them casualties and leaving critical areas like the medical facility exposed. There, Elena pointed to a group of wounded soldiers who were struggling to move toward the supposed safety of the command bunker. Sergeant Williams and his team got caught in the open when the attack started. They're not going to make it to cover without help. Peterson followed her gaze and saw what she had spotted. 3 soldiers, one of them clearly badly wounded, trying to make their way across 50 meters of exposed ground while enemy fire stitched the dirt around them. Elena made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her only as the quiet base medic. "Peterson, I'm going to get them. I need you to prepare the surgical area for trauma cases. We're going to have multiple critical patients in the next few minutes." She moved toward the tent entrance, then paused and looked back at the young corpsman. "And Peterson, if anyone comes through that entrance who isn't wearing coalition uniforms, you get behind the surgical table and you stay there until I come back." Before Peterson could respond, Elena was moving. She emerged from the medical tent in a low crouch, the transition from protected space to hostile environment triggering muscle memory that felt as natural as breathing. The Elena Vasquez who stepped into the gunfire was not the gentle doctor who had entered the tent that morning. She was a ranger, trained to operate in exactly these conditions, moving with the fluid precision of someone who understood how to survive in the spaces between bullets. The transformation was complete and terrifying in its totality. Elena's every movement spoke of professional competence in dealing violence and surviving its application. She covered the distance to the wounded soldiers with a series of bounds and rushes that used every piece of available cover. A supply pallet here, a generator housing there, the hull of a damaged vehicle that had been awaiting repair. Her medical bag bounced against her hip as she moved, a reminder that even in combat mode, her primary mission remained saving lives rather than taking them. Sergeant Williams looked up in shock as Elena slid into the depression where he and his men had taken what little cover they could find. "Doc, what the hell are you doing out here? You need to get to the bunkers." His protest died in his throat as he took in her tactical gear and the professional way she was scanning the surrounding area for threats. "Jesus Christ, Doc. What?" "Questions." "Later, Sergeant." Elena cut him off, her voice carrying an authority that made him instinctively follow her lead. "Right now, I need to know how badly Martinez is hit, and I need to know if you can move under your own power." She was already working as she spoke, her hands moving over Private Martinez's wounds with the same gentle competence she had always shown, but now backed by an aura of controlled lethality that changed everything about how the soldiers perceived her. Martinez had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and leg, serious wounds that required immediate attention but weren't immediately life-threatening if treated properly. Elena worked with practiced efficiency, applying pressure dressings and administering morphine while keeping one eye on the tactical situation around them. The attackers were still advancing, but their movement had slowed as coalition forces began to organize a more effective defense. Elena estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the enemy reached their position. "Williams, can you and Johnson carry Martinez between you?" Elena asked as she finished her initial treatment. When the sergeant nodded, she continued, "Good. I'm going to lay down suppressing fire to cover your movement back to the medical tent. When I start shooting, you move fast and you don't stop until you're inside that tent. Understood?" The casualness with which she discussed providing covering fire, as if it were as natural as prescribing antibiotics, left both soldiers staring at her in amazement. Elena checked her weapon one final time, a series of movements so smooth and automatic that they clearly represented years of intensive training and muscle memory. She positioned herself at the edge of their makeshift cover, taking a firing position that provided optimal fields of fire while minimizing her exposure to return fire. The transformation from healer to warrior was now complete, and what emerged was something that would haunt the memories of everyone who witnessed it. "On my mark," Elena said, her voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. 3, 2, 1. Move. What happened next would become legend among the survivors of Forward Operating Base Delta. Elena rose from cover like a force of nature unleashed, her weapon coming up in a smooth arc that spoke of thousands of hours of training. The first shots she fired were not the wild spray of someone fighting for survival, but the precise, measured fire of a professional warrior who understood exactly how to apply violence with surgical precision. Her bullets found their targets with mechanical efficiency, center mass shots that dropped 2 advancing attackers before they could react to this new threat. The remaining enemy fighters, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of effective resistance from what they had assumed was a non-combatant area, dove for cover and began returning fire with less accuracy than their advance had suggested they were capable of. Williams and Johnson moved like their lives depended on it, which they absolutely did. They half-carried, half-dragged Private Martinez across the open ground while Elena's covering fire kept the attackers pinned behind a concrete barrier near the motor pool. Her shooting was methodical and devastating. She wasn't trying to rack up a body count, but rather to control the tactical space and deny the enemy the ability to maneuver effectively. Every shot was calculated to maximum effect, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down while her people moved to safety. But as Elena provided covering fire, something else was happening that would prove far more significant than the immediate rescue operation. Colonel Martinez, observing the battle from the command bunker's elevated position, had watched through binoculars as his quiet base medic transformed into what appeared to be a special operations soldier. The precision of her movement, the professional competence with which she handled her weapon, the tactical awareness she demonstrated in choosing her firing positions. These were not the actions of someone with basic medical training. These were the actions of a warrior. "Get me a direct line to Lieutenant Jackson," the colonel barked to his communications officer. "I want to know everything about Dr. Vasquez's background, and I want to know it 5 minutes ago." There was something in Elena's combat performance that suggested capabilities the base had never known it possessed, and Colonel Martinez was beginning to understand that he might have been drastically underutilizing a critical asset. Elena's covering fire had given Williams and his team the window they needed to reach the medical tent. But the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The attackers had regrouped and were now advancing in coordinated teams from multiple directions. Elena found herself in an increasingly untenable position, isolated in the open with limited ammunition and no immediate support. Her ranger training told her that the smart move was to fall back to a more defensible position, but her medical instincts rebelled against abandoning the wounded soldiers who were still scattered across the base. The decision that Elena made in that moment would define not just the battle, but the rest of her life. Instead of retreating to safety, she began moving forward, using fire and movement tactics to advance toward a group of coalition soldiers who had become pinned down near the communications array. Her actions were those of someone who understood that sometimes the only way to save lives was to take calculated risks that others might consider suicidal. As Elena moved across the battlefield, something remarkable began to happen. The coalition defenders, who had been fighting a disorganized retreat, began to rally around her unexpected display of tactical competence. Soldiers who had been falling back in disorder found themselves following the lead of the quiet medic, who was moving with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how to fight this kind of battle. Her presence became a focal point for the defense, not because she was the senior officer present, but because she was demonstrating the kind of professional competence that soldiers instinctively recognized and followed. Sergeant Williams, having delivered Martinez to the medical tent, emerged with his weapon ready to support Elena's advance. "I don't know what the hell is going on," he shouted to Johnson over the sound of gunfire, "but Doc knows what she's doing better than any of us." The 2 soldiers began providing supporting fire for Elena's movement, their actions inspiring other defenders to begin coordinating their efforts rather than simply trying to survive individually. Elena reached the pinned-down soldiers near the communications array to find Lieutenant Jackson wounded and struggling to maintain command of the situation. The young officer had taken a bullet through his shoulder and was barely conscious, his radio operator dead beside him from a direct hit that had also damaged their primary communications equipment. Elena's arrival was like a lifeline thrown. To drowning men, suddenly they had someone who understood both how to treat Jackson's wounds and how to coordinate their tactical response. "Jackson, can you hear me?" Elena worked quickly to assess and treat the lieutenant's wounds while keeping one eye on the approaching enemy forces. "Your shoulder's going to be fine, but I need you to stay conscious. Can you tell me what assets we have available and what the enemy's primary objectives appear to be?" Her questions were those of someone conducting a tactical assessment, not just providing medical care. Jackson's response, delivered through gritted teeth and visible pain, revealed something that changed Elena's understanding of the entire situation. "They're not trying to overrun the base," he gasped. "Intelligence intercepts suggest they're after something specific, something in the command bunker or—" His eyes focused on Elena with sudden clarity. "Something in the medical facility. Doc, I think they might be after you." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Her transition from combat soldier to medical officer had been carefully managed through official channels, but intelligence services had long memories and longer reach. If someone had identified her true background and capabilities, the medical facility wasn't just a target of opportunity. It was the primary objective. Everything else might be a diversion designed to isolate and capture a former ranger with detailed knowledge of special operations tactics and capabilities. Elena's mind raced through the implications. If the attackers were specifically after her, then every moment she spent in combat was endangering not just herself, but everyone around her. But if she allowed herself to be captured or killed, the base would lose both its primary medical officer and, as events were proving, one of its most tactically competent defenders. The choice she faced was between personal safety and the lives of everyone on the base. The decision, when it came, surprised no one who had truly known Elena during her ranger days, though it would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the quiet base medic. She made the choice that she had always made when faced with impossible options. She chose to fight. "Jackson, I need you to get word to Colonel Martinez," Elena said, her voice taking on the tone of someone issuing operational orders. "Tell him that Dr. Elena Vasquez is actually former Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 75th Ranger Regiment, and that I'm requesting permission to organize the base defense on a tactical level. Tell him we're not dealing with local insurgents. We're dealing with professional soldiers who have come specifically for intelligence assets, and we need to respond accordingly." Elena helped Jackson to a more protected position behind the communications equipment, then began doing something that no one on the base had ever seen her do before. She began taking command of the tactical situation with the natural authority of someone who had been trained to lead soldiers in combat. Her voice carried across the immediate area as she coordinated defensive positions, assigned fields of fire, and organized the kind of professional military response that the attackers clearly hadn't expected to encounter. "Sergeant Williams, I need you to take 3 men and establish overwatch positions on the elevated platforms near the supply depot," Elena called out, her voice carrying the tone of absolute authority. "Private Johnson, you and Martinez are responsible for coordinating ammunition resupply for all defensive positions. Corpsman Peterson, I need you to establish triage areas at 3 separate locations in case we take heavy casualties." The transformation was complete and undeniable. Elena was no longer pretending to be anything other than what she had always been underneath the medical officer's exterior, a warrior trained to lead other warriors in the most dangerous and demanding circumstances imaginable. The soldiers responding to her orders did so without question, recognizing something in her demeanor that transcended rank or official position. But even as Elena organized the base's defense, she was aware that the enemy's tactics were evolving. The initial assault had been designed to create chaos and confusion, but now that the attackers had met organized resistance, they were adapting their approach. Through her tactical assessment, Elena could see that they were beginning to concentrate their efforts on specific objectives rather than trying to overrun the entire base. The next phase of the battle would test not just Elena's combat skills, but her ability to reconcile the warrior she had been with the healer she had become. Because the enemy's primary target wasn't just former Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, it was Dr. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had spent years learning to save lives rather than take them. The attackers wanted to capture or kill not just her military expertise, but her medical knowledge and the intelligence value that represented. As Elena coordinated the defense of Forward Operating Base Delta, she realized that the greatest battle she would face wouldn't be against the enemy soldiers advancing toward her position. It would be the internal struggle between the part of herself that knew how to win battles through controlled violence and the part of herself that had sworn to do no harm. The resolution of that conflict would determine not just who survived the day, but who Elena would be when the shooting finally stopped. The enemy was closing in, and Elena was about to face the ultimate test of whether it was possible to be both, a warrior and a healer without losing her soul in the process. In the distance, she could see the attackers regrouping for what appeared to be a final, concentrated assault on the medical facility. They were coming for her, and Elena was going to have to decide once and for all whether the gentle doctor or the lethal ranger would define who she truly was. The radio crackled to life with Colonel Martinez's voice, tight with the strain of command under fire. Dr. Vasquez, Staff Sergeant Vasquez, this is command. I'm authorizing you to take tactical control of the base defense. Whatever you need, whatever resources you require, you have my full authority. There was a pause, then the colonel's voice continued with something that might have been awe. I've been watching your performance out there. I don't know why you're wearing medical insignia instead of combat stripes, but right now you might be the most qualified person on this base to keep us all alive. Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar weight of responsibility she had carried as a medic, but the heavier, more complex burden of command in combat. She had walked away from this feeling 5 years ago after watching her entire squad die in an Afghan valley. The promise she had made to herself, kneeling in blood and sand as her brothers in arms breathed their last, was that she would never again be responsible for sending soldiers into harm's way. But circumstances had a way of making such promises impossible to keep. Understood, Command, Elena responded, her voice carrying across the defensive positions with unmistakable authority. All coalition personnel, this is Staff Sergeant Vasquez assuming tactical control. We are dealing with professionally trained enemy forces conducting a precision operation. This is not a random attack. They have specific objectives and specific targets. We're going to deny them both. The immediate tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Elena's enhanced assessment revealed that the enemy had divided into 3 primary assault teams, each approaching from a different vector, but with coordinated timing that spoke of extensive planning and rehearsal. The largest group, approximately 15 fighters, was moving directly toward the medical facility from the northwest. A second team of 8 was attempting to flank through the motor pool area, while a third group appeared to be setting up some kind of support position on the ridge overlooking the base's main entrance. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that these weren't the kind of attackers the base had been prepared to face. Elena's combat experience allowed her to read the enemy's movement patterns and equipment in ways that revealed their true nature. These were special operations soldiers, possibly from a foreign military or well-funded mercenary organization. Their weapons were modern and well-maintained, their tactical gear was professional grade, and their movement techniques were textbook examples of small unit assault tactics. Elena made her first command decision, and it was one that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as a healer. Sergeant Williams, I want you to take a fire team and establish a reverse slope defense position on the north side of the communications array. Your job is to let the main assault force pass your position, then hit them from behind when they're engaged with our primary defensive line. It was a classic Ranger tactic, allowing the enemy to commit to an attack, then destroying them with converging fire from unexpected directions. Johnson, I need you to coordinate with whoever's manning the heavy weapons. Tell them to shift their primary fields of fire to cover the approaches to the medical facility, but not to engage until I give the signal. We want the enemy to think our defensive response is disorganized and reactive. Elena was implementing a defense in depth, designed to draw the attackers into a killing field where their superior training and equipment would be neutralized by superior positioning and coordination. But even as she organized the tactical response, Elena was struggling with something far more personal and complex. Every order she gave, every tactical decision she made, was increasing the likelihood that people would die. Not just the enemy soldiers who had come to capture or kill her, but the coalition defenders who were following her commands into increasingly dangerous positions. The weight of command in combat was exactly what she had fled from 5 years ago, and now she was voluntarily taking it up again. Corkman Peterson appeared at Elena's position, his medical bag in one hand and his service weapon in the other. His face was pale but determined, and when he spoke, his voice carried a resolve that Elena hadn't heard from him before. Doc, Staff Sergeant, whatever I'm supposed to call you now, I'm staying with you. I know I'm not combat trained like you are, but those are my patients in that medical tent, and I'm not abandoning them. Elena looked at the young medic for a moment, seeing something of herself in his determination to protect those under his care. Peterson, I need you to understand something. What we're about to do, what I'm about to ask all of these soldiers to do, some of them aren't going to survive it. Command in combat means accepting responsibility for sending people to their deaths in service of a larger objective. Are you prepared for that reality? Peterson's answer came without hesitation. Ma'am, if we don't fight, they're all going to die anyway. At least this way, we have a chance to save some of them. His words carried an echo of the promise Elena had made to herself years ago, and she realized that in some ways, she had never stopped being a soldier. She had just found a different way to serve. The enemy's final assault began with a coordinated mortar barrage that Elena had been expecting but hoping wouldn't come. The attackers had brought indirect fire support, which meant they were even better equipped and more professional than her initial assessment had suggested. The mortars weren't random harassment fire. They were precision strikes designed to suppress specific defensive positions and create gaps in the coalition's defensive line. Elena's response demonstrated why Ranger training was considered among the most comprehensive military education in the world. All positions, this is command. Incoming indirect fire, take cover and maintain radio discipline. Do not return fire until the ground assault begins. We want them to think their prep fires were more effective than they actually were. She was using the enemy's own professionalism against them, allowing them to believe their preliminary bombardment had achieved its intended effect. As the mortar rounds impacted around the base, Elena found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She was praying, not for victory, not for survival, but for the wisdom to make the right choices in the minutes that would follow. The decisions she made in the next quarter hour would determine who lived and who died, and the weight of that responsibility was almost crushing. The ground assault came exactly as Elena had predicted, with the main force moving directly toward the medical facility while the flanking element attempted to penetrate the defensive perimeter through the motor pool. What the attackers didn't expect was that their target had anticipated their tactics and prepared a reception that would turn their professional competence against them. Elena's first trap was sprung when the flanking element moved through what appeared to be a gap in the defensive line near the motor pool. Sergeant Williams and his fire team, positioned exactly where Elena had placed them, waited until the enemy soldiers were fully committed to their movement before opening fire. The precision and coordination of the ambush was devastating. 8 enemy fighters reduced to 3 in the span of seconds, with the survivors forced to take cover in positions where they could be contained but not eliminated. But it was Elena's personal response to the main assault that would become the stuff of military legend. As approximately 15 enemy soldiers advanced toward the medical facility, Elena made a decision that seemed to contradict everything about her new identity. As a healer, she left her protected position behind the communications equipment and moved forward to meet them. Elena's advance toward the enemy assault force was not the reckless charge of someone who had lost control. It was the calculated movement of a professional warrior who understood exactly how to use terrain, timing, and surprise to maximum tactical advantage. She moved from cover to cover with fluid precision, each bound taking her closer to the advancing enemy while keeping her protected from their return fire. What Elena was doing was something called reconnaissance by fire, using her own movement, and the enemy's response to gather intelligence about their positions, capabilities, and intentions. But she was also doing something more complex and dangerous. She was deliberately making herself the primary target, drawing the enemy's attention and firepower toward her position and away from the medical facility where wounded soldiers lay helpless. The first enemy soldier Elena engaged was a team leader who had moved ahead of his unit to coordinate their final assault on the medical tent. Elena's shot took him center mass from a range of approximately 40 meters, a precision shot made, while moving that demonstrated the kind of marksmanship that required years of intensive training to achieve. The enemy soldier dropped without making a sound, his weapon clattering to the ground beside him. But Elena's engagement with the enemy assault force revealed something that changed the entire nature of the battle. As she moved through her tactical bounds, using fire and movement to systematically engage the attackers, she began to recognize faces and equipment that shouldn't have been there. These weren't foreign special operations soldiers or mercenaries. They were Americans. The weapons were U.S. military issue, the tactical gear was standard NATO specification, and the man she had just killed was wearing dog tags that glinted in the morning sun. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow, forcing her to take cover behind a concrete barrier as her mind tried to process what she was seeing. These were American soldiers, possibly special operations personnel, conducting what appeared to be a black operation against a coalition base. The implications were staggering. Someone with significant resources and authority had ordered American soldiers to attack an American base, specifically targeting Elena herself. Elena's radio crackled with transmissions from her defensive positions, soldiers reporting enemy casualties and asking for further orders. But Elena found herself unable to respond immediately, struggling with the realization that every enemy fighter she killed might be an American soldier following orders from someone with legitimate authority. The moral complexity of the situation threatened to paralyze her at the moment when decisive action was most critical. "Staff Sergeant, this is Williams. We've got the flanking element contained, but the main assault force is still advancing. On your position. What are your orders?" Sergeant Williams' voice cut through Elena's moral crisis, reminding her that regardless of who the attackers were, they were still trying to kill coalition personnel and capture or eliminate her. Elena made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She keyed her radio and gave the order that she knew was necessary, but wished with every fiber of her being that she didn't have to give. All positions, continue engagement. Protect coalition personnel and deny enemy objectives. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Positive identification before engaging. Minimum necessary force. She was ordering her soldiers to kill Americans, and the weight of that command was almost unbearable. But even as Elena struggled with the moral implications of the battle, her tactical mind was working on a different problem. If these were American Special Operations soldiers conducting a black operation, they would have extraction plans, command authority, and resources that made them far more dangerous than foreign attackers. They wouldn't simply withdraw if their initial assault failed. They would adapt, call for reinforcements, or escalate their methods to ensure mission success. Elena's analysis of the enemy's capabilities and intentions led her to a conclusion that was both tactically sound and personally devastating. The only way to end this engagement was to eliminate the enemy's command and control, which meant identifying and neutralizing whoever was directing the operation. In practical terms, that meant Elena had to stop thinking like a defender and start thinking like a hunter. The transformation that came over Elena in that moment was complete and terrifying. She had spent 5 years learning to save lives, to heal rather than harm, to be someone other than the efficient killer she had been trained to be. But the situation demanded that she become, once again, exactly what her Ranger training had made her, a precision instrument of controlled violence. Elena began moving toward the enemy command position with the systematic precision of someone conducting a stalking operation. Every step was calculated, every piece of cover utilized to maximum advantage, every sound and movement designed to bring her closer to her target without revealing her position. She was hunting human beings with the same methodical competence she had once used to track wounded animals in the forests of her childhood. The enemy command position was located approximately 100 meters from the medical facility, positioned to provide overwatch and coordination for the assault teams. Elena's approach took her through terrain that she had walked hundreds of times as the base medic, but now she was seeing it through the eyes of a predator rather than a healer. Every depression, every piece of equipment, every structure became a tool for concealment and advancement. As Elena closed distance to the enemy command position, she could hear voices speaking in English with American accents, discussing tactical adjustments and casualty reports. The confirmation that these were indeed American soldiers conducting an operation against Americans made her mission both more necessary and more personally devastating. She was about to kill soldiers who might be following legitimate orders from authorized commanders, but who were threatening the lives of personnel under her protection. Elena's final approach to the enemy command position required her to cross approximately 20 meters of open ground where she would be completely exposed to observation and fire. The tactical solution was straightforward but required perfect timing and execution. She would have to move when the enemy commanders were distracted by radio communications and focused on their operational coordination rather than perimeter security. The moment came when Elena heard the enemy commander coordinating what sounded like a request for close air support or additional ground forces. Elena rose from her concealed position and crossed the open ground in a series of bounds that brought her to within effective engagement range of the enemy command post. Her movement was fluid and nearly silent, the result of training that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours of practice. Elena's engagement of the enemy command position was swift and decisive. 2 shots, fired from a range of approximately 15 meters, eliminated the enemy commander and his radio operator before either could react to her presence. The precision of her shooting and the tactical competence of her approach demonstrated why Ranger training was considered among the most effective military education in the world. But even as Elena neutralized the immediate threat, she was aware that the battle was far from over. The elimination of the enemy command element would disrupt their coordination and potentially cause them to withdraw, but it might also trigger contingency plans that could escalate the situation beyond the tactical level. Elena had to consider the possibility that her actions might have strategic implications that extended far beyond forward operating base Delta. The aftermath of Elena's engagement with the enemy command position brought an eerie quiet to the battlefield. The systematic gunfire that had characterized the assault gave way to scattered, disorganized shooting as the remaining enemy elements lost coordination and began operating independently. Elena's tactical assessment suggested that the attackers were beginning to withdraw, but she knew that the cessation of immediate combat didn't mean the end of the threat. Elena made her way back toward the medical facility, moving carefully through terrain that might still contain enemy personnel. As she approached her own defensive positions, she was struck by the transformation that had occurred not just in herself, but in the entire base. The soldiers who had known her only as the quiet medic were looking at her with a mixture of awe, respect, and something that might have been fear. She had revealed capabilities that changed everything about how they understood both her and themselves. Corpsman Peterson was waiting for her at the medical tent, his face pale but determined. "Ma'am, we've got multiple casualties coming in. coalition and enemy wounded. What are your orders regarding treatment priorities? His question forced Elena to confront the ultimate test of whether she could reconcile her identity as a warrior with her oath as a healer. Helena looked at Peterson for a moment, then at the wounded soldiers, both coalition and enemy, who were being brought to the medical facility. The decision she made in that moment would define not just the rest of the battle, but the rest of her life. Peterson, we treat them all. Coalition personnel first based on triage priorities, but we treat them all. Enemy wounded receive the same medical care as our own people once our personnel are stabilized. The decision to treat enemy wounded with the same care as coalition personnel was more than just adherence to the Geneva Convention. It was Elena's declaration that she was still, fundamentally, a healer rather than just a killer. The warrior. Skills were tools she would use when necessary to protect those under her care, but they would not define who she chose to be. As Elena worked alongside Peterson to treat the wounded, she found herself operating in a space that she had never imagined possible, simultaneously functioning as both a combat leader and a medical officer, using violence to protect life rather than to destroy it. The integration of her two identities wasn't perfect or comfortable, but it was functional and, more importantly, it was authentic to who she had become through years of struggle and growth. The final phase of the battle came not with dramatic explosions or heroic charges, but with the quiet professionalism of soldiers securing a battlefield and caring for casualties. Elena coordinated the tactical cleanup while simultaneously managing medical operations, her dual role as warrior and healer becoming something new, a protector in the truest sense of the word. Colonel Martinez arrived at the medical facility, as Elena was suturing a wound on one of the enemy soldiers who had survived the engagement. The colonel watched for a moment as Elena worked with the same gentle competence she had always shown, treating the man who had been trying to kill her, less than an hour earlier. "Staff Sergeant," the colonel said quietly, "I think we need to talk about your future assignment." Elena looked up from her patient, meeting the colonel's eyes with a calm that hadn't been there that morning. "Sir, with respect, I think my current assignment is exactly where I need to be. I'm a medic. I'm also a soldier. For the first time in 5 years, I don't see those as contradictory identities." She returned her attention to her patient's wound, her hands steady and sure. "But if there are more situations like this one, the base needs to know what resources it actually has available." The colonel nodded slowly, understanding that he was looking at someone who had found a way to integrate capabilities that most people would consider mutually exclusive. "Staff Sergeant, I'm recommending you for a combat leadership position with medical specialization. The military needs people who understand that sometimes the best way to save lives is to be prepared to take them." Elena finished suturing the enemy soldier's wound and moved on to check on her own personnel. As she walked through the medical facility, she realized that the quiet medic who had awakened that morning no longer existed. In her place was someone new, a warrior healer who understood that true protection sometimes required the willingness to do violence, but who never forgot that the ultimate goal was always to preserve life, even the lives of enemies. The battle for Forward Operating Base Delta was over, but Elena's real journey was just beginning. She had discovered that it was possible to be both a healer and a warrior without losing her essential humanity, but that integration came with responsibilities and moral complexities that would challenge her for the rest of her career. The quiet medic was gone, but what had emerged in her place was something far more complex, more capable, and more truly herself than she had ever been before. As the sun set on Forward Operating Base Delta, Elena Vasquez stood in the medical tent surrounded by wounded soldiers, both coalition and enemy, who owed their lives to her skills as both a warrior and a healer. She had found a way to honor both aspects of her training and her nature, and in doing so had become something the military desperately needed but rarely produced. Someone who understood that the highest form of courage wasn't the willingness to fight, but the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary to preserve what was worth protecting.